So to help catalyze a movement of discipleship, we have to understand how social space works. Bobby Harrington and Alex Absalom, in their book, Discipleship That Fits, talk about 5 different discipleship spaces, and here they are. There is the public space, which is groups of 100 or more. There is the social space, usually groups of 30 to 70. There is personal space, groups of 4 to 12. Transparent space, groups of 2 to 4. And then divine space, which is an individual before God himself. So if you think about the ministry of Jesus, he used public space, right? The Sermon on the Mount, huge multitudes of people. He used social space. Obviously, there's the group of the 70 that he sent out. There is the personal space, which would be the 12 disciples. But then Jesus also used the transparent space with Peter, James, and John, who had a special relationship with Jesus. And obviously, Jesus had his own relationship with God. Now, usually a local church will have these same contexts. The public space would usually be our Sunday morning gatherings. The social space, that can be a little more nebulous depending on the community, but usually there's larger groups of people that gather in some capacity, though not the whole community gathered together. Then the personal space would map to small groups. And the transparent space, the groups of 2 or 4, sometimes churches have these, sometimes they don't. This is really the discipleship vehicle space, right? Groups of 3 to 4. What can happen in a group of 3 to 4 or 3 to 5 is really different than what happens in a group of 8 to 12. Both are good. In fact, here's the mentality that we need to have. All of these spaces are discipleship spaces. They're all good spaces. They're all useful for something. But if you think about these spaces like an oven, right? The bigger the space, the harder it is to heat the oven. Now, Sunday morning tends to be a really big discipleship space. It's really useful for a lot of things. It's useful for direction and for vision and for some teaching. But it's hard to get that oven up to a really hot temperature, like crucible temperature. Whereas in a group of 2 to 4, it's a smaller space and it's easier to get that temperature up. So that in a discipleship space, there are transformational things that can happen that are just never going to happen on a Sunday morning because there's a deeper level of vulnerability, of connectedness, of relationship. It's way easier to get that space up to crucible temperature than it is a Sunday morning space. The question for us as disciple makers is, how do we use each disciple space in order to create culture? And really that is our job as disciple makers, is to think about how we create a disciple making culture. If we create a disciple-making culture, then discipleship is naturally going to happen. Now, I've heard it said that there's 2 main ways that we create culture. One is through the language that we use, and the second is the things that we celebrate or the stories that we tell. The language that we use and the things that we celebrate. This is why in the Bonhoeffer Project we've focused so much on the why of discipleship, the language of discipleship, on getting clear about what the gospel is, the kingdom gospel, and why it demands discipleship. And what this means is that in every discipleship space, over and over and over again, we need to be using this language to make clear what the gospel is, what grace is, and why discipleship matters. I had a mentor, a friend of mine and a mentor. He said that as a leader, you should be talking about vision so much that you want to throw up because you've said the same thing over and over and over again. He said, about that time where you feel sick because you've said it so many times, that's about the point at which people will say, oh, wait, okay, I think I got this. So how do we as disciple makers craft and use language that creates culture? Now, here's an example from my context, from my local church where I'm a pastor at Long Beach Christian Fellowship. Here's some language that we use around discipleship and what a disciple is. Remember, we've talked about using viral language. And in order to make our language really viral and sticky, we use these pictures to describe the life of a disciple. The first picture represents the reality that discipleship starts with our adoption. So we use the word adoption. A disciple is grounded in grace. The second picture is a picture of life as an ambassador of the kingdom of God, that as adopted children, our work is to make present the kingdom of God for others as Jesus did. And the third picture is the picture of an abundant life, that we are constantly asking the question, Jesus, what are you speaking? And we respond to what we hear, and that sort of listening and obedience leads into abundance. Now, we use these pictures and these ideas and these words and this language in every single discipleship space that we have, because we want to create a culture where people understand what we think is important, right? That living as someone who is being made whole by the grace of God, but not only that, who is looking to live that wholeness outward for others. That's what we want to communicate over and over and over again, whether it's in a public space on a Sunday morning or it's in a transparent space within a discipleship group. Language is so critical because through language, we're revealing what we value and we're revealing the story that we believe we're called to be a part of. The second way that we create culture is through the things that we celebrate, and I think we largely do this through the stories that we tell. Here's the problem with being a leader or a pastor, is that I have credibility to some degree because I'm a leader, because I'm a pastor, and I also lack credibility because if I stand up on a Sunday morning in a public space and I tell some story of discipleship, they'll listen to some degree because I'm the pastor and you're supposed to listen to the pastor, but to some degree, they won't listen because I'm the pastor and realistically I'm paid to say certain things and they expect me to say certain things. This is where the value and the critical nature of storytelling comes in. If I stand up in a discipleship space and I tell a story about God's grace or about God's grace moving through me for others, people will nod and say, okay, great. But let me tell you, if Sally Mae or Jim Bob stands up there, and they're not being paid to stand up there, but they're telling a story about their experience of God's grace or their experience of loving another person as Jesus does, the impact of that story is completely different. We need to empower people. We have to empower people if we're going to see movements of discipleship to stand and to tell stories. And not only stories of success, but also stories of failure. Because by telling stories where not everything went perfectly, we're making it safe for people to be human beings who don't always get it right. We're creating a space to say, hey, discipleship is a process and a journey, and we only figure it out by making course corrections, and sometimes it goes great and sometimes it doesn't. But boy, if we can get people telling those stories, that's part of how we ignite movements. So what would it look like to take Sunday morning, for an example, public discipleship space, to make that a storytelling space where people are constantly hearing stories, where your language around the gospel and your language around what it means to be a disciple, your viral definition of a disciple, is constantly being reinforced. Another way that we reveal what we celebrate is by the questions that we ask. What are the questions that we regularly ask in a discipleship space? For example, once a month in our community at Long Beach Christian Fellowship in Long Beach, California, we ask three questions on the first Sunday of the month. How are you going to make time and space this month to become grounded in the love of God? What's one thing you're going to do to love another person that Jesus has placed in your life in a tangible and concrete way? And what do you think Jesus is speaking to you, and how will you respond? These are questions that help reveal our discipleship values. We value being grounded in the love of God. We value loving and serving others as Jesus does. We value obedience to what we think the Spirit is speaking to us. So part of the way that we can create culture is by crafting questions and regularly asking questions that by asking the question, we're actually revealing what we value. As disciple-making leaders, our job is to hone language that tells a story, a big story about God's work in the world, a big compelling why about why we need to follow Jesus in order to see the world remade. And we need to empower people to tell stories that convince them that the average person, me, you, and everybody else, can do this. This isn't just for super Christians or superheroes. It's for the average person who, if they submit their life to Jesus, Jesus is going to give them experiences that become stories, that become testimonies of what God is doing in the world. Our vision in the Bonhoeffer Project is to help catalyze local movements of discipleship that lead to world revolution. And you and I, as disciple makers, if we will focus on creating discipleship culture through the language that we use and the stories that we tell, then we can be a part of Jesus' work of making all things new in the world.